Just to introduce myself, I'm the Jemima Parker. I'm the chair of Zero Carbon Harrogate. Zero Carbon Harrogate is an apolitical organisation, and we're a voluntary organisation all about trying to move us as quickly as possible to a low-carbon economy in the Harrogate district. And so it is with great pleasure that we are hosting these hustings this evening, and it was without apology that these are a climate hustings. We are about to enter the make or break decade for our planet, for our climate, and so it's really essential that the politicians who take us into that, our leaders, have policies going forward for the next potentially 5 years of their term of government that are adequate to help us to decarbonise as we enter this critical time. And so I'd like to thank the candidates for coming this evening and for giving their time and for taking this step to stand in order to represent us. And I'd like you as the audience, please, to respect the fact that they are giving their time to serve and represent us. And so if we could have respectful behaviour, please, I would be very grateful for that. And if I can ask the candidates to be respectful to each other as well, please. During the course of the evening, the debate will be filmed and by the Harrogate-Informer and will be going online. If you would prefer not to be shown in any footage, please could you speak to Tim afterwards and he'll ensure that you're not shown in any footage. But it would be great if we can actually allow the debate to be seen more widely. This evening the order will be that we'll start by having each of the candidates give you a 5-minute presentation in alphabetical order of their surnames, so we're going to be working across. And then there'll be a time to hear their answers to a variety of questions. If you booked on Eventbrite, you will have seen that there was the opportunity to submit questions. We had a large number of questions submitted, and having grouped those into topics, we've selected somebody who have written a question that was the best worded of those that covered the topic most thoroughly, we felt. And so those questions are largely in the room. If there's time at the end, then we can move on to open questions from the floor. So without further ado, I'm going to ask our first candidate, Kieran George, to give his 5-minute presentation.
Thank you for having me here today. Thank you for your attention. I'm Kieran George of the Yorkshire Party. I'm from a military family myself, and I've lived in many places across the country and deployed abroad, but I've always come back to Harrogate. It's a place I have a lot of happy memories in, a place I adore completely, and I've spent the majority of my life here. I went to Rossett High School in college. I spent the entire of my career here in recruiting, working at the job centre, as well as various recruitment agencies in the area, helping people find work. The 4 generations of my family live in the area. I've got my grandma, my cousins, my brothers in the area. So I've got deep ties to the area, and my Dad met my mother while he was deployed in the area, so in ways I owe Harrogate my very existence. I think that that is something that is worth returning back, doing right by Harrogate. So the reason I'm standing in this constituency for the MP is just so that I can address the biggest threat that Harrogate and Yorkshire faces at the moment, and I believe that is the current climate emergency we're facing. The Yorkshire Party pledges a net zero carbon Yorkshire. We want to make sure that we aren't just looking at it on a national level. We want the region itself to be net zero carbon. It's not a promise you'll see on other pledges. Mostly pledges in that area from the other parties focused on a national level. But we have to focus on the regional level because, as with so many other issues, the national parties don't do their fair share of serving the region of Yorkshire. So I feel the Yorkshire Party needs to address that on a local level. We can't address the issue of climate change in Yorkshire specifically if we don't have the transport funding, which we do not at the moment. We can't handle the climate change issue if we don't have the education funding, which are lower in Yorkshire than in the rest of in the southeast, in the London area. We can't face the climate emergency we have right now if we do not have the political and economic power that Yorkshire deserves. And we do deserve better. Yorkshire deserves better. So we should vote Yorkshire. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kieran. I'd now like to invite Andrew Jones to speak.
Thank you very much, Jemima, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start by thanking Zero Carbon Harrogate and the Churches Together for organising this event. I have lived in Harrogate since the 1990s, originally from Ilkley. I went to school in Bradford, university in Leeds, and then had a 25-year business career before entering public life. I was a councillor for 8 years. I represented the High Harrogate ward and was cabinet member for resources, and in that role I tackled such issues as repaying the council debt and refurbishing our public buildings. Since 2010 I have been Member of Parliament for this constituency. Of course there are no MPs now, as there are no MPs when Parliament has dissolved. And during my time as a Member of Parliament I focused upon securing budget increases for public services in our area, focused upon transport, business and the environment. Now we're having this election because we have reached a stalemate, a deadlock in Parliament. The issue that has caused this is of course Brexit. The paralysis in Parliament I think has frustrated the nation, and I think we have to break out of it. The only way I can see to achieve that is to honour the referendum result and to do so with a deal, to leave with a deal. Indeed, I have voted for this on each of the... Ladies
and gentlemen, I ask for respectful listening.
We are respectful.
And could you please let the candidates finish what they're saying without interrupting? Thank you.
What I was saying is that I have voted for the deal on each of the opportunities it has been presented to Parliament. Now I voted to remain and I campaigned to remain. So it's with some regret that I have had to do that. But I do not think politicians can pledge to honour the result of a referendum and then not do so. There are countries where politicians pick and choose which public votes they follow, but those are not good countries and not good robust democracies. Now, the core issue that obviously affects Zero Carbon Harrogate and the campaign upon is climate change. And I think we do have a climate emergency. And I'm pleased that the government and the Conservative Party recognise that in its commitment to net zero. We're not starting from scratch. We have much I think the UK can be proud about. Britain is the leading developed economy in decarbonising. We have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by more than any other country in the G7. That's by 42% in the last 30 years. Britain was the first major economy to pass a Climate Change Act, and this was cross-party work from before I was a Member of Parliament, but I think it shows that there is real consensus in Parliament to move this agenda forward. That act means we now have an independent climate change committee, which tells the government what it has to do originally to achieve 80% reductions by 2050. Now, of course, following scientific advice, net zero by the same date. We're a leader in ocean conservation. We have responsibilities for vast areas of seas around the world, and we have already gone a very long way to achieving the 30 by 30 UN initiative. That's 30% of our seas protected by 2030. We're leading the way in things like plastic use reduction and moving to a circular economy, and we're one of the biggest contributors to the UN Climate Fund. But of course there is much more to do, and within the manifesto, which I think is the greenest that we have ever done, I was pleased to see commitments for a new independent Office of Environmental Protection, introduce our own legal targets, including for air quality. We need to crack down further upon waste, with a new levy to increase the proportion of recyclable plastics on our waste stream. We need to make sure that this issue stays at the top of the agenda. It is fantastic that this has risen at the agenda. I have been working on this since being a councillor, taking it further forward as a Member of Parliament, and again as a Minister. If I am elected, I will continue to work with many of the amazing groups locally on local initiatives to make our area more sustainable. If I'm elected to be Member of Parliament, I will take that work forward nationally. Environmentalism is a key Conservative value. It is one of the things that brought me into politics. The concept of stewardship is at the heart of conservatism. Leaving the planet in a better state than we found it is the heart of the government's 25-year environment plan. But being green is not just about environment and climate change. I think it is also about social justice. The poorest are those who suffer the worst from the effects of the climate emergency, and I think there is no more important issue in our politics today. Good time.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'm now going to invite Judith Rogerson to address us.
Thanks, Jemima. When I was reading through the Liberal Democrat manifesto for this general election, there was one line that really jumped out at me. And that was the line that said, we're the first generation to know that we're destroying the environment, and the last generation with a chance to do something about it before it's too late. And that's absolutely correct. And if it weren't for Brexit, which has dominated our politics for the last 4 years, the climate emergency would be at the top of the agenda for the Liberal Democrats. And it should be at the top of everyone's agenda. And there's a reason why Brexit and climate change are so important to me and so important to the Liberal Democrats. And it's because both of those things are about the future of our country and what sort of country we're going to become. But climate change is more important than that. It's not just this country, it's about our entire planet. So we can't afford to waste any more time. And we can't do it by ourselves. And that's one of the reasons why Brexit is a bad idea. We need to be working with our European partners to tackle this emergency. So what do we need to do? Well, there's been quite a lot of debate about what should be the target date for reaching net zero carbon emissions. And the Liberal Democrats have looked at the evidence, and we've come up with a plan which we think is achievable, but it's ambitious. We would completely put a stop to net carbon emissions by 2045, but the vast majority of the work can and must be done in the next 10 years. So under our plan, by 2030, we would like to see 80% of our electricity generated by renewables. We want to see all of our houses properly insulated, not just to reduce carbon, but also to tackle fuel poverty. And that's why we would prioritise insulating the homes of those with the lowest incomes. We also want to see in the next 10 years that all new cars are electric cars. And we need to complement that by having a public transport system, a rail service in particular, that's reliable, affordable and green, so that we don't need to use our cars as much as we do now. We should ensure that every decision that's made at government level, at local councils, within businesses and by individuals, keeps in mind progressing towards that target of a zero carbon economy. The Liberal Democrats would encourage investment in green projects, and we would support innovation in net zero carbon technologies that are going to reduce carbon emissions. We'd also plant 60 million trees every year, not just to reduce carbon, but also to protect and to restore our natural environment. And with that in mind, we would pass a Nature Act, which would set targets, legally binding targets for air quality, soil, water, and also to improve biodiversity. And the Lib Dems have got a good, strong track record on the environment. It was a Liberal Democrat policy in government which saw the drastic reduction in the use of plastic bags in this country. And it was also the work of Ed Davey and Vince Cable that saw a great expansion of offshore wind. And they worked to bring Siemens to Hull, which is where they manufacture the wind turbines. And in fact, Vince Cable was here in Harrogate today, and he was talking to me about the Green Investment Bank that he set up, which was unfortunately privatised by the Conservatives, and he was talking about the work that had done. And at a local level as well, in the last year, it's been the Liberal Democrats who've been leading the way on environmental issues. It was Lib Dem councillors who brought the motion in Harrogate Borough Council to stop using single-use plastics within council buildings. And it was Liberal Democrat councillors who set in motion the process of declaring a climate emergency, getting the council to recognise what needed to be done. We've got to do much more. We've got to bring back the subsidies for renewable energies that were taken away by the Conservatives. We've got to make sure that we've got a Secretary of State for Climate Change, because that was abolished in 2016. And we've got to keep campaigning to stay in Europe, because taking us out of Europe is going to make the job so much harder to work together to reach targets with our European neighbours and around the world. Labour want to spend billions on renationalising utilities and on the trains, but that's not the answer. That's going to be a distraction. It's going to be ruinously expensive. It will distract from the task in hand, which is to tackle the climate emergency. So that's why the Liberal Democrats have got a plan which is ambitious but achievable, and working together we'll build a brighter future for our children, grandchildren and the generations that come after them.
Thank you, Judith. And now to Mark Sewer for the Labour Party.
Thank you so much for inviting me along tonight. It's an absolute privilege to be here, and it's such a privilege to speak to you all, and I look forward to taking your questions. As you've heard, I'm Mark Sewards. I'm the Labour Party candidate for Harrogate and Knaresborough, and I was in 2017 too, and it was an absolute joy when I found out that I was selected to come back and fight for this constituency again. It's clear to me that the climate emergency is the greatest threat that our planet faces right now. Not just our country, but our planet. We cannot have a political party in government that will just tinker around the edges. We have to take bold and radical action now so that our children have a planet that they can actually habitate. It's really unfortunate that we have a Conservative government now that doesn't take this seriously, that's funded by the big polluters, and that will not take action in the next crucial decade to stop the climate emissions and to stop the climate emergency that we know threatens us all. Labour is the only one with a real plan to tackle this. We're going to invest £250 billion in a green transformation fund that doesn't just, as I say, tinker around the edges, but transforms our economy, creates 1 million good green jobs that ensures that our children have a planet that they can grow up on without having to suffocate at the same time. Ultimately, this will take collaborative action. Brexit has been a huge distraction. It's occupied every single part of our politics and has meant that our country has not got to grips with many of the problems and challenges facing it today, including the climate emergency. So I have to say, on Brexit, I really like my party's policy. We're going to negotiate a sensible deal within 3 months, put it back to the people in 6 months so that we can move past this. And let me be really clear now. As your Labour MP, I will be passionately campaigning for Remain. We have to work. We have to work. We have to work with our European partners if we're going to make progress on this issue and so much else. But there are other things that we have to consider at this election. We're not just electing a government to deal with the climate emergency, they will deal with so much more. Public transport is another massive issue, and we think that transport really should be public. If we're going to get people out of cars and onto trains and onto buses, those things have to be properly funded. 3,000 bus routes have been cut by this government that will reinstate. We will renationalise the railways. We will bring them back into public ownership. Not because it's a distraction, because it's the only thing to do. With the most expensive rail fares out of any major economy in Europe, something has to be done now. Not just review the franchise system, but bring it back into public ownership where we can sort out the mess that the Conservatives made all those years ago when they sold off our rails. And of course, as a maths teacher, education is also very close to my heart. In Harrogate and Knaresborough, you've lost £125 per pupil, or you will have done by next year, because of cuts that the Conservatives have brought in since 2015. I see every day that our teachers are heroes. They're often working extra hours, having to make up the difference that's been caused by these Conservative cuts. And I think that that's a real shame. We should have schools that have SEN specialists, so that your children can get the proper education they deserve, even if they have special educational needs. We have to make sure that we have TAs and fully trained teachers, so that our children are not being taught by substitute teachers all year round. Now, there's a lot more I want to say, and as I said before, it's really important that we elect a government that deals with all of the issues. But I'm very hopeful about Labour's prospects here in Harrogate and Knaresborough. I am so lucky to have a wonderful team that goes out on the doorstep night after night, day after day, campaigning for votes in this constituency. It will never ever be a wasted vote to vote for Labour in Harrogate and Knaresborough. And if you elect me as your MP, I'll ensure that you always have a fiercely independent Labour voice in Parliament, not just standing up for the issues that matter to us all, but standing up for the issues that matter in Harrogate and Knaresborough too. Thank you so much for having me tonight, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much to the candidates for their presentations and doing so well in keeping to time. Very impressive. We move now to your questions.
Before you do, can I make a comment? We have a visitor in this building who was not very welcome, but is flying around from time to time.
Yes.
So if you see a pigeon upstairs, either catch it or annoy him.
Thank you, Trevor. So our first series of questions are taken from a pool of questions that were submitted on Eventbrite, as I said, and we're going to allow each of the candidates to answer to that question if they wish before we move on to the next. And our first question we wanted to have from somebody who submitted called Zara, and she's one of the few people we might be not been able to track down. Is Zara in the room? No. Stephen, would you be able to read Zara's question for us, please?
Yes, I will. Well, this is from Zara, who put herself down as under 21 years of age. What are you going to do to ensure young people are educated on climate change, specifically facts and figures?
And as Kieran spoke first, it's then Andrew's turn to start on this one.
Well, I think this issue actually is already right at the top of young people's agendas, and that is a very good thing. I go into schools right across the constituency most weeks, and these are the first questions that I get asked. So the key thing is to make sure that education, science-based education certainly, to answer Zara's point, is included within our education system, but it is being, and I am very confident that it will continue, and it is helping to change the agenda.
You don't have to stand up.
Sit
down for questions.
It is young people and children who've drawn so much attention over the last few months to climate change, and I think as adults we should probably be ashamed that it's the children who had to do that and get it into the news. But it is about making sure that in schools that children are getting the facts and figures on climate change, not frightening them, but making them realise, I think, as Andrew said, they already know. But climate change, to me, I think was one of the places where this sort of fake news came from. It was, back in the day when you'd have people denying climate change up against world experts. And I think that that's part of tackling this culture that's developed of people saying anything they like. And I think we've got to learn to challenge people when they say things that are fundamentally wrong. And make sure that our children know that it's okay to do that. And sometimes people aren't telling the truth. And you've got to call them out when that happens.
There's no question that the climate emergency and climate change has to be on the national curriculum. And in answer to Zara's question, it's very important that we train teachers up so that they can address that on the national curriculum in lessons, and not just lessons, but engaging lessons too. It's really important that we take key issues. So, for example, the BBC, when we had a record-breaking heat wave this summer, they made a big song and dance about, we're going to break the national record on the heat wave. So it's a fantastic thing. And I think that is the sort of figure that we could deal with in lessons. We could put that up and say, why on earth are we celebrating this? But it is true that our young people are already telling us in great numbers that the climate emergency really matters to them. In 2019, has seen the blossoming of a wonderful new movement, several new movements that see our young people engaged in the climate emergency. And under Labour, that should absolutely continue, because it needs to be dealt with now.
On the topic of climate change, but when it comes to education, we can't educate our youth if we continue to have this disparity in education funding between Yorkshire and areas like the South East, when we have 4,000 a year per student versus 6,000 a year per student. It's just unacceptable. We can't invest in educating students on climate change if we don't have the money to invest. So we need to make sure that there is a fair allocation of education funds throughout the country.
Thank you. We're going to move to a transport question with Simon Johnson. Is Simon here? Right. We have the microphone to Simon. Microphone coming to you, Simon.
Thank you very much. Evening, candidates. I'm Simon. This is about transport, and a very local question as well. So I recently returned from a trip to Belgium and Germany, where in cities like Nuremberg and Munich and Bruges, I was lucky enough to see the positive impacts of extensive and joined up and largely off-road cycle lanes, which encourage residents to consider cycling as the first choice, above car use, for commuting and for leisure. I'd like to understand the candidates' attitude to and plans for the transformation of cycling facilities in Harrogate to encourage healthier lifestyle choices and to provide practical alternatives to vehicle congestion and naturally to reduce carbon emissions. And as an add-on, I'm also conscious that cycling facilities, as well as needing cash investment, may also need trade-offs like denying space available to cars on roads or the sharing of public parks, and we've got plenty of those in Harrogate. How would candidates then bring consensus amongst the differing interests of people in favour and people opposing to make sure that there's no inertia or there isn't a very diluted solution to this issue?
Thanks, Simon. There's a lot to deal with in that question. Yeah, I think walking and cycling are very important. They're things that we need to be promoting. It's the healthiest way to travel. Sometimes it's the most efficient way to get around on a bike rather than being stuck in traffic jams. I think we should be encouraging people to be cycling, and that means looking at the layouts of the road. And as you say, that will lead to conflict. But sometimes we have to make difficult decisions and say, yeah, we understand that people want the road for the cars, but we've got to think about how we can best adapt that for cars and for walking as well. So certainly something I'm someone who likes to walk around a lot. I don't have my own car, so I tend to walk around a lot in town, and I think I enjoy doing that. You know, you get to see and enjoy what we've got on offer in town. I think we need to be encouraging more people to do that, and it might mean some difficult decisions, but dealing with the climate emergency generally is going to require some difficult decisions and changing the way that we live our lives.
Right, thank you, Simon. Great question. Labour has a really clear plan on this. We think that walking and cycling has to be encouraged in our towns and cities. And so something we're going to do is we're going to be encouraging local councils, with funding to prioritise making cycle lanes and more places that are pedestrianised too. I do not drive, so I often have to walk places. I used to cycle a lot, certainly more when I was younger, and I have to say the benefits are amazing. But Labour's actual plan to do that is to encourage councils to turn cities and towns into perfect places for people to cycle, allocating more space for cycle lanes, which will cause some animosity. So your second part of your question was how are you going to bring people along? One of the ways that I think we are going to bring people along with all of these policies, not just the cycling one, is by pointing to the data that shows that the planet cannot deal with with as many cars anymore. We have to bring people along by convincing them that the climate emergency is real. We've come a long way over the last decade, but we've got more work to do on that, and we'll certainly be championing that cause in government if you were to elect a Labour government on December the 12th.
Thank you very much for the question, Simon. I'm a cyclist myself. I cycled here today. I've cycled to all the jobs I've had in the area, and cycling was a part of me helping tackle my obesity when I was obese a couple of years back. So I am really experienced with the issues that face cyclists. I've seen all supports for locking up my bike in the area, the various paths throughout Harrogate that make it difficult to get from one spot to another on a bike. You don't get knocked off your bike twice in a fortnight without realising the issues with the cycling infrastructure in the area. But in the end, this all comes down again to the disparity in funding. We receive far less transport funding in Yorkshire than we do in the rest of the country. So we just need to make sure that when it comes to allocating funds for cycling infrastructure, they are fairly allocated to the Yorkshire area, and that we have a strong regional government in Yorkshire that can make sure that we get that funding and keep receiving that funding. Thank you very much.
I think there's absolutely no doubt that cycling and walking has to be a key part of every community's transport plans for the future. We're certainly seeing more resource go into it from a national level. It actually is something that is really right at the heart of your question, quite difficult sometimes to win those arguments. I'm thinking back specifically to when I was a councillor and we had all sorts of challenges with cycling on the Stray. It was hugely controversial. I don't think anybody thinks it's controversial now, but my goodness, it was a problem at the time. So we do have to win the arguments. I have absolutely no problem whatsoever in the concept of sharing road space, sharing parks, and making it easier, frequently with segregated cycle paths, to encourage people. But I also am aware that there will be protests. So we have the County Council developing a cycle path on the Ockley Road to go alongside and separate to the road. And I have had a significant number of people come to see me to protest about these plans. So there is still quite a piece of work to be done, really winning the argument. we've had a big debate locally about transport with the relief road, which was proposed to go from, well, go effectively through the Mid Gorge. I was delighted to be a part of that protest, and we have seen that off. But we also now need to pivot into what's something that we actually will vote for, not just vote against. And what we need is a sustainable package. That will mean the County Council and the District Council, supported by government funding, all coming together to create a sustainable package of transport for our area. And it will mean some tough decisions, so we just need to remember that it's not easy to do this. We all agree with it in ideas, but sometimes winning those hearts and minds is tough. But I think having won them on things like cycling on the Stray, or seeing off the relief road, or winning extra funding for the Ockley Road Cycleway, I think it shows it can be done.
Thank you. Mark's going to take the next question first, and it's a housing question from Grant Blakemore. Grant, can you give us a wave? Here we are.
Good evening. Harrogate is planning over 12,000 houses to fulfil the local plan objectives. How would the candidates ensure that the house builders incorporate all of the energy efficient and energy generating measures to ensure that their developments are sustainable?
Right, fantastic question. It's really, really important that within 3 years we make sure that all new builds have proper insulation so that they are zero carbon. It's a fundamental principle that underpins our green industrial revolution policy. So that's with regards to all new builds. It's essential that we build more houses in this country, but at the same time we have to respect the fact there is a climate emergency, and we have to make sure those new builds meet the criteria so that they are zero carbon and they're not having a negative impact on our environment. Just to extend from that, it's so important that all the houses we currently have, 29 million in the UK, are also insulated properly. We can't just stop with new builds. This will be done within 10 years of a new Labour government. It will take a lot longer. There's a lot more complications with older buildings, as I'm sure many of you are aware if you own an older home. But we have to do it, and we have to do that now. So yes, we have to make sure the new builds respect the rules with regards to being zero carbon, but we also have to make sure that all properties that currently exist meet the new rules as well.
Thank you for the question. Part of making sure that new builds abide by green standards is just having in place a government that's able to police and enforce those standards to the new builds. So a part of that would just be making sure that we have a stronger government in Yorkshire as well as a regional government for Yorkshire, just to make sure that we've got someone there that wants to and is able to enforce those kind of standards on new builds in our area. Thank you very much.
Well, I think there's going to be consensus breaking out here, because there's absolutely no doubt at all that we need to have homes built to correct standards. And correct standards means high-performing homes that we then hold house builders to account for the delivery. We, as Mark has said, do need to go further on this as well, because it isn't just about new homes. The real challenge is going to be in retrofitting into existing homes. And that is expensive and it is difficult. And I think we've made quite good progress in terms of insulation. There's a long way to go still. But included in your question, Grant, was microgeneration. And that is something we have not made much progress with, I don't think, in the country. I'm just thinking back again to when I was a councillor. We installed ground source heat pumps into off-grid council houses. We were the first council to do this. It was about 16 years ago. And it was considered a bit quirky at the time, a bit odd. But now I think it clearly needs to be mainstream. So, yes, through national standards, holding the house builders to account, but the challenge will come not in the insulation, but in retrofitting older properties. It's expensive and it's challenging.
from the Liberal Democrat perspective, it's quite simple. We would legislate to make sure that all new houses were built to zero carbon standards. There were previously zero carbon standards in place for new housing, but that was dropped, and we would bring that back. We would also legislate to see things like that every new house built would have solar panels on the roof, that kind of thing that will make a difference over time. That's part of our plan to switch away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy to be the source of our energy in this country.
So our next question comes from Leighton Reggae. Is someone pronounce your name right? Leighton?
I'm up here. I'll use my voice.
Lovely, thank you, Leighton.
Achieving carbon neutrality will require significant investment and could transform our economy. What will you do to make sure Harrogate and Knaresborough benefit from new green industries?
Well, the Yorkshire Party's policy is to make sure that Yorkshire itself is net zero carbon. So that does involve making sure that we focus on the local area when we are implementing greener policies, making sure that 6 million trees a year get planted in Yorkshire, and that will include the Harrogate area as well as much of the rest of Yorkshire. It's just making sure that we have a party in place that is willing to fight for Yorkshire and Harrogate's needs and rights, and make sure that we're not ignored as we have been previously by national parties.
Well, I think the future is going to be much more of a local economy in lots of different areas, including in power generation. We already have a significant number of people working in low-carbon businesses. There are 400,000 people working nationally in low-carbon businesses, and I have met companies in this area doing great work already on this issue. So I think the key thing from a government perspective is to recognise that this is what the future looks like and to run towards it, not run away from it, to invest in the new technologies, to make sure that we remain at the cutting edge of this. Every single community in the country will benefit from this. In terms of the jobs, which was your key question later, then I think it's about recognising that integrated supply chains, this will have like a network of routes that goes into every economy in the area, and Harrogate's economy is strong. We have great companies already. We just need, therefore, to support them more.
I agree, Leighton, that becoming carbon neutral is going to require significant investment and big changes in the way we live our lives and the way that our economy works. I said in my presentation at the start that the Liberal Democrats will support investment in green projects and innovation. I think part of my job as the MP would be promoting Harrogate and Knaresborough and making sure that people come here. So as over time the country's economy changes, as our local economy changes, it's drawing people in here and making this an attractive place to invest in.
Thank you, Leighton. So the question is about what we're going to specifically do for Harrogate and Knaresborough. So Labour's plan includes 1 million green new jobs, unionised jobs at that too. And we want to make sure that those jobs are distributed in places that aren't just London. I think far too much of the focus always ends up in London. So we want to make sure that those jobs go to Yorkshire towns, Yorkshire villages, where that we retrain people from fossil fuel industries and from other industries that might be on the decline, so that they can actually work in places like Harrogate and Knaresborough, and they can actually do the good green jobs that we need to transform our economy. Now, we have to make sure this is accountable too. It's all well and good me saying to you now, oh, we're going to make sure the jobs come to Harrogate and Knaresborough. We're going to put together a panel of the Chancellor, the Business Secretary, and the Bank of England Governor to make sure that every single penny that is spent by government goes towards meeting our climate change targets, and make sure that that money that is spent is also distributed evenly across the regions that need it. Yorkshire and the Humber is one of those regions, and I'll make sure, as will a Labour government, that the funding comes here to Harrogate and Knaresborough, that the jobs come here to Harrogate and Knaresborough too.
Thank Thank you. We move on to a question about farming now, and this is from Helen Ball. And as far as I'm aware, Helen is not here unless she's going to... Oh, you are here. Great. Helen, would you like to bring us your question, please?
Yes, I would. My question is this. We are now much more aware of the environmental damage done by animal agriculture. What will the parties do to help farmers in our constituency to transition away from meat and dairy production?
Well, we're certainly seeing significantly greater understanding of the environmental impact of different types of agriculture. If farmers wish to move away from their traditional projects, then I think it will be a question of education and support. However, I'm a little unsure about whether or not you thought it should be made mandatory to move people on. I don't think we can perhaps do that. There are only certain parts of our landscape which will only be fit for part of sheep production, for example. So I'm not sure we can really give you a detailed answer, but if people are making changes to their businesses, then there will be, as there currently are, grants to help them make those transitions. But I don't think we can go further to say it should be mandatory.
I think this all feeds into adapting, encouraging people who want to change the way that we run our economy, and that includes farming. So if people are moving away from meat and dairy, then we need to support and encourage those projects if that's the way people are going. But slightly loath to come back to Brexit, but the reality is that that is the issue which is most going to affect our farmers over the next few years. If we leave the EU, they are going to be hit hard. So the first thing we need to do is to stop Brexit from happening, because our farming industry across the country is going to be devastated if we go down, particularly
Labour has a very clear plan on animal welfare. We've dedicated an entire manifesto to it, which I'd encourage you all to read. With regards to animal agriculture, which was your specific point, we're going to make sure that there are new standards on meat and dairy and everything else too. There are people working in that sector that don't have to often have the security in their employment that other sectors do, and we're also going to make sure they're protected. But with regards to animal welfare, there is no party on the stage today that has a broader plan than Labour to protect animal rights. With regards to the climate emergency, yes, it all feeds into that. And if we do leave the EU, Labour has a plan to protect the agricultural rights of animals in those industries, even if we leave. But ultimately, my plan is to remain, and that's why I'll be campaigning to remain in any second referendum. But we want to make sure that animal rights are protected regardless. And under a Labour government, you will have that security. Animal rights will be protected no matter what happens to us within the EU.
There's a growing market for meat substitutes and alternative milks. As technology evolves, we'll see a larger market that supports plant-based diets, and we'll see a natural changeover from farmers who are in the meat and dairy sector over to more focus on a plant-based diets and farming that requires to support those kind of diets. As the market grows, it will support that kind of farming style, and we'll see more investment in that area. So the focus should be on supporting that kind of technological change and helping farmers transition over to the new change we will naturally see in the coming years.
So our next question comes from Kirsty Hallett about energy generation.
Kirsty, an overview on onshore wind power, which is happening, and I think that's something we need to think about quite carefully, because That is a cheap and effective way of producing electricity. We need to look at other renewable methods, tidal power. There's projects off in South Wales and that we can look at there. I mentioned a moment ago putting solar panels on all new houses and old houses as well. There are lots of ways that we can generate power without putting more carbon into the environment. So we need to move away from fossil fuels. The Liberal Democrats are very clear that we would ban fracking. That is not the way forward to produce So under our plan, in the next 10 years, it could be 80% renewable, with the ultimate aim, with 15 years after that, being completely based on renewable energy, so that we're not putting any carbon into the atmosphere.
So specifically, we've got 6% of all of our energy consumption is done by buildings and electrical generation, electricity that's sent to buildings. We need a lot of new wind farms. So we propose to build 7,000 offshore wind farms and 2,000 onshore wind farms by the end of the decade, as well as enough solar panels to cover 22,000 football pitches. This needs to be done immediately. We also oppose fracking. We think it's a ridiculous practice. We think that the danger it poses to the environment is not worth risking, and so that's why we need the renewable energy sources. We must make sure that those on the lowest incomes do not pay for our attempts to prevent the climate emergency, but that's why a Labour government will spearhead these innovations in in green new energies and green new jobs that I've talked about initially.
We've seen a large transition away from coal power, but this has largely been replaced by oil power rather than renewables. And this is in part due to the growth in fracking around the world, creating cheap natural gas for use in power production. The Yorkshire Party proposes a ban against all fracking, and we need to not only make sure that happens in Yorkshire and the UK, but encourage against fracking around the world, just to limit the tendency to switch over to natural gas power rather than focus on renewables as we should. We do need more investment in renewables. One of the key areas is not just the renewables themselves, but investing in battery technology as well, because the difficulty with renewables is not just getting the renewables up, but making sure we have a backload of power to address spikes in energy demand around the country, so that we're not facing issues of brownouts that would put the poorest among us at the greatest risk. So we need to make sure that when we are investing in renewable technologies to replace our power production systems, that we are addressing a broad approach for renewables, not just solar and wind, but every opportunity we can for renewables, as well as making sure we have that battery infrastructure in place.
Well, we need clearly to see through the change which is already underway as we decarbonise our power supply. We're going to require more power, so compromising people's quality of life is not the answer. This is about changing the power generation method. But the progress is quite good here. When in 2010 the coalition came to power, 6% of our energy came from renewable resources. Now it's 33%. 52% of our power is generated from low carbon sources. What does the future look like? The future looks like embracing change and making sure that we continue with things like offshore wind. The prices of these things are falling significantly. If you look at the options that people, basically the amount of subsidy required, it's going down all the time because economies of scale mean that they are able to deliver the power for less money. It will require things like carbon capture. It will require things like hydrogen. We need to look at how we can use hydrogen to power things like our transport network, cars or trains, So I think the opportunities ahead of us are exciting, incredibly exciting. If we look at the technologies which are in play. But we need to therefore have a very open mind and not embark upon one route only. Let the market and let investment deliver all sorts of different routes. We've seen nearly £100 billion invested in low-carbon energy since 2010, and that's brought forward all sorts of exciting opportunities, the battery technology developments that Kieran was just talking about. So I think this is an exciting opportunity, but it has to be open in mind, open in approach, and significant in quantity.
Losing track then. So Mark will lead us on the next question, and that's from Michelle Beckett, and it is it's over here. It's a question about migration.
Thank you. In the light of children being forcibly displaced due to war, persecution, violence, extreme poverty and climate change, as candidates, will you support a commitment to resettle 1,000 unaccompanied and vulnerable child refugees to the UK a year as part of the UK's resettlement scheme and ensure that unaccompanied children in Europe are included in the commitment?
Yes, absolutely. There's no question that we have to meet our obligations, our international obligations, to those children and to other people too, who will become migrants because of the changes that are happening to the environment and for other things too, such as wars. Certainly, well, more recently when we saw the crisis in Syria and what that drove, we didn't do enough. We didn't do enough as a country to meet our obligations to help those people. So with me as your MP and with a Labour government, we will meet those obligations. I promise you that.
I absolutely would. Refugees and the countries that take them in both benefit when they abide by their duty to accept them into their country. We can only benefit when we treat them with the dignity and respect that they deserve, and I wouldn't see our country rebuff them at all.
And again, another yes, Michelle. We have a strong record in the UK on supporting asylum.
Really?
Our international record for international development budgets. We are one of the few countries in the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, can you show respect in allowing each of the candidates to answer?
Disgusting.
If you wish to talk to them afterwards with your own views and discuss it privately, that's fine. But please, can you allow everyone else to hear their views? Thank you.
We have a strong record in supporting international development budgets. We're one of the few countries in the world that meets our 0.7% commitment, which I voted for and heartily support. So the answer to your question, Michelle, is yes, I would.
Michelle, unequivocally yes. The Liberal Democrats have always supported the rights of asylum seekers and those seeking sanctuary in this country. Frankly, it's disgraceful the way that people have been treated in this country in the past. The hostile environment that's been deliberately created by the Home Office in this country, we should all be ashamed of that. It's really something that I've got limited but personal experience of the impact it has on asylum seekers who come here escaping from wars and from terrible things, and often they're left destitute, and that's got to stop. And that's why the Liberal Democrats have said that we would commit to changing the law so that asylum seekers would be allowed to work. At the moment they're not, they're forced into destitution. It's appalling. In particular, their unaccompanied children. Again, we should be ashamed that we haven't welcomed more unaccompanied children into this country.
Bravo.
Our next question comes from Neil Hind of the Pinewoods Conservation Group, but Neil couldn't be with us this evening, so Christine Jack is going to read his question for us.
Right, Neil's question is, much has been made in manifestos around planting new trees to help address the climate emergency. But do you agree a priority should be to also preserve existing trees? With that in mind, do you support the planning decision by Harrogate Council to allow the doubling of the Harrogate Spring water site onto acres of public woodland, resulting in the loss of potentially hundreds of trees?
Thank you for the question. I have been engaged with the Pinewood Group on Twitter, talking to them about the plans for the expansion of Harrogate Spring Water Factory. I have made myself clear in public that I am against any plans our Conservative local council would agree to. The Conservative local council have shown that they cannot make the right decision for our area with their plans for the Relief Road, their allowance of the treatment of the stray. Any deal or agreement they come to, I do not believe would be acceptable at all. So I would oppose this plan for expansion.
Well, I think the Pinewoods Conservation Group do a fantastic job. I have volunteered with them on a couple of occasions and have supported their work. I think if we do have to see any trees removed as part of a planning and development process, then I think we need to make absolutely sure that we more than compensate with new planting elsewhere. So I think overall it's a question of making sure that development is done in a sensitive way as possible, but we can't stand in the way of all development, particularly housing development, where I think we need to have more homes within our country.
Yes, this is a question that I think three of us were engaged with Pinewoods on Twitter. My answer, which hasn't changed, was that I'm concerned at the idea of cutting down trees. Certainly in our manifesto, we're all for planting more trees, and that flies in the face of that. What I'm not saying is you should never cut down any of the trees for development, but also I'm very much someone who likes to look at the evidence, and I like to know the facts. So I think it's not right to make it say here and now yes or no, because I haven't seen those detailed plans enough to take a view on it. But I would be extremely cautious about cutting down trees for plans, and I'd want to be reassured that anything that was put back in its place was the same, if not better. But I don't think Twitter or on-the-spot questions are the right time and place to be making important decisions like that. You need to look at the project in detail and carefully come to a reasoned opinion.
It is so important that we build more houses in this country. But at the same time, there is places you can build them and there are places you shouldn't. Since the coalition government, Eric Pickles, who was Community Secretary at the time, they relaxed planning laws to allow developers to build on greenfield sites and places that weren't appropriate. It's not been acceptable that while we're trying to build these new houses, that we're selecting sites that are simply not appropriate for them. This is a particular concern in Harrogate and Knaresborough, where greenfield sites have often been selected for their profitability for new developers, and we've not actually tried to address the housing crisis properly in this country. Now, I know that the specific question was about Pinewood, and yes, I do support them. I do not support the development and the removal of those trees. But there is a far broader question here about how we build our houses and where we build our houses. We need a brownfield first policy once again. If we don't have that, then we're still going to have this situation where houses are proposed for inappropriate sites. But on top of that, and I have to mention this, we have to scrap the Conservatives' bogus definition of affordability. Even if we build houses, even if we build houses in these locations on greenfield sites, which I do not support, they have to be affordable. And 80% of the market rate is a ridiculous figure to ask for many people in many communities, not just the ones in Harrogate and Knaresborough. So we need a new definition of affordability to go along with our brownfield first policy. And the affordability has to be linked to people's incomes.
Thank you. Just for clarification, the question was about the bottling plant as opposed to about housing. So just for clarification on that.
Got carried away.
Our next question comes from Barbara Penny. Barbara's up there, and Barbara, you all right to give us a nice loud voice from up there?
I think so. I'd like to ask, it's been mentioned a couple of times already, do you think it would be more effective to work together to take action against climate chaos with the other EU countries? And if you think it will be more effective, why? And if you don't think it will be more effective, why not?
Just to check, did everybody hear the question clearly? Yeah, super.
Well, I think it actually is clearly appropriate to work with other EU countries, but not just the EU, Barbara, to work with countries right across the world. And the reason why it is appropriate is that the climate change affects every single country on the planet. So it is requiring an international response. So yes, clearly work with others, and we should not be restricted in any way by our ambition on who they are.
Absolutely, we need to be working with our EU partners, and walking away from them, which is what the Conservatives want to do at the moment, is only going to make that more difficult. Now, let's take, for example, the Paris Agreement, which set targets for reducing temperature increases and so on across the world. Absolutely essential. The countries around the world working together. But the EU was instrumental in getting that in place. And the UK was instrumental in getting the EU to do that. And if we walk away from them, we're losing our influence in the world. And we're losing our influence across... the Paris Agreement, which Donald Trump wants to withdraw from, it's a catastrophe that's happening. So we need to be sticking with our EU partners to work together so that we can take on people like Trump who are trying to turn things around. But if we go it alone, we're losing our voice in the world. And this is just not the time to be doing that. And that's why we've got to put a stop to Brexit.
Absolutely. There is no way we can achieve our climate targets unless we work closely with every other nation on Earth, including the EU. But let me make this really, really clear. Labour plans to meet our climate emission targets by 2030 in or out of the EU. It takes a government with resolve to do that. To just say, well, we're out of the EU now, we can't meet them, will not be acceptable. We have to lead the way in meeting our climate emissions targets so that other countries that aren't in the EU also follow suit. It's so important. So I would say, absolutely, stay in the EU, meet our climate targets. But if we don't stay in the EU, we have to meet them too. And we'll meet them as a country and lead the way internationally.
Collective action is completely very important, so we should be cooperating with other European countries. There's been a lot of focus on shifting responsibility for climate change onto individuals and individual nations, but we cannot tackle climate change alone. We need to work with others to get our emissions down and to deal with climate change directly.
Now we come to a question from Rachel Carr-Whitworth. Rachel, who's there? tax on fossil fuels.
Under the Conservative government, the UK has been ranked the least transparent G7 country regarding fossil fuel subsidies. If elected, will you promise to end all subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, including tax breaks to North Sea oil companies and gas companies, and take measures to improve transparency on this issue?
I think we should be more transparent on those sorts of things, but ultimately our plan is to stop using fossil fuels. So if we're not using fossil fuels, we don't need to worry about subsidies to the fossil fuel producers.
Yeah.
We're going to remove our reliance on fossil fuels. But at the same time, this last decade, under the Conservatives and Lib Dems, and then under the Conservatives again on their own, corporate tax rates have been cut for the very largest companies, the very largest polluters. We know that 100 companies globally produce more emissions, more than 50% of all global emissions, and we have to deal with that now. So as well as removing our reliance on fossil fuels, yes, we will close those tax loopholes, and we will also increase the corporate tax rate so that these companies pay their fair share. It seems obscene to me that we've spent a decade rewarding them for polluting our planet and for making huge profits while doing so. Right now, we need to make sure that those tax cuts are reversed and that those companies pay for what the damage that they've caused, and also pay to prevent the climate emergency that faces us all now.
I'm in complete agreement that we need a new, clearer tax system that cannot be circumvented, more direct carbon taxes that look at how much emissions companies are putting out and taxing them directly so that these kind of taxes can't be avoided and these subsidies can't be taken away from the public view. So we would need to make sure that those are put in place.
Well, the tax paid by companies in the oil industry is high, and it needs to stay high because we need to move our economy from being a fossil fuel-based economy to a no-use of fossil fuel economy. So I can't tell you when we will remove any fossil fuels entirely, but clearly that is not the direction we should be going in, and consequently we need to think about subsidising them because they won't exist.
So our next question comes from Mike Kay. I'm looking for Mike. There you go, Mike. Microphone coming to you from behind, Mike. There you
go. I'd like to sort of ask two questions really. And I would quite like to get an answer because there seems to be a lot of generalisation around things. How would each party get to zero carbon by their own party deadlines? And how will they incentivise businesses to engage with this? And will they put an actual physical price on carbon, as in £10, £20 a tonne?
So I won't cover old ground. I've already told you about the panel we're going to create, the Business Secretary, the Chancellor and the Bank of England Governor. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the Office of Budget Responsibility accounts for the cost of not acting. So the cost of not acting is going to be far, far greater in the long term than the cost of acting. Many of the criticisms that are levelled at my party for what we're proposing to do is that you can't find this money from anywhere. You're just pledging to spend money that you don't have. But I'll tell you now, if we don't spend this money right now, it's going to cost us more in the long term. So the Office of Budget Responsibility will outline exactly what the cost will be of not acting, and always feed back into our financial decision making, into our fiscal policy making. On top of that, we're also going to make sure that all of the companies in this country meet our environmental obligations. So if you are listed on the stock exchange and you are not outlining exactly how you are meeting our climate obligations to reduce your carbon footprint to zero, you will be delisted. You will not allow to be listed on the company, on the stock exchange. Go on, sorry.
Aren't they already in that position with ESOS 1 and 2? Just finishing ESOS 2 now. So all of those companies, so if you're a company with more than 250 employees, the turnover of more than 50 million. You're already in that now, so that was imposed by Europe. That's called heat source.
Yeah, but ultimately, if we leave Europe, we have to make sure these companies abide by those regulations anyway. And you also need a government that's willing and able to actually tackle them and say, we are going to delist you. And I don't think we have the government right now that will do that. So under Labour, we'll deal with the private sector with the plan that I've outlined, but we'll also deal with our own spending with the other plans that I've outlined tonight.
The Yorkshire Party's stated goal is to have a net zero carbon Yorkshire by 2030. The way we'll be approaching this is by looking at the emission sources. A third of those are from power generation, a third of those are from transport. So the main goal there would just be make sure that the Yorkshire has the funding in place to address those emission sources, greater the transport funding, greater funding in the power area, and just to make sure that we can reduce those emissions. And then the other side is to, one of the best ways to sequester carbon is just to make sure that other than direct carbon sequestration at the sources of carbon, which we hope to eliminate by eliminating those sources in power and transport, is just to plant trees. Tree planting is one of the most efficient way of locking away the carbon we're producing, so that Yorkshire is committing to plant 6 million trees a year to make sure we are locking away that carbon, as even if we do stop emitting completely, we still need to make sure that we are accounting for the emissions that we have already produced by making sure that we continue a policy of planting trees and alternative ways of carbon sequestration. Climate change is already producing an invisible debt on our future. They will already have to pay for the damages we are doing today and have already done. So part of getting the funding for eliminating the future damages caused by climate change is just to acknowledge that invisible debt and make it visible by getting that funding in place.
Well, Mike, it is critical that it isn't just an aspiration. The aspirations are backed by some detailed plans. And we have published a 25-year environment plan, we have published a clean growth strategy. Ultimately, these things are now in law. We have passed a law that says we will be net zero by 2050. The UK's fifth carbon budget was passed into law. That equates to a 57% reduction from 1990 levels of carbon emissions by 2032. So we have plans in place, they are tangible, these documents exist for anybody to read them, they're available online. They cover a multitude of different things, including plans for each individual sector. So government is taking action, but ultimately we will need to all take action on this, because it will be a question of...
Sorry, speaking too loud.
Oh, is that the issue, Mo? Okay, right. Thanks, Trevor. Change can't just be made from above. We all have to think about how we will live our lives. It is the aggregate of billions of individual decisions that we will make. In collaboration with national objectives, national plans, national support, that will get us to this net zero as soon as we can, and we have said this will be achieved by 2050, in line with the Independent Climate Change Committee.
So, I've already talked about our plan for renewables, and so moving away from fossil fuels. Our plan for transport, so move away from petrol to diesel cars to electric cars. Electrifying the railways to make that more environmentally friendly, get people out of their cars in the first place. But again, innovating, investing in new technologies that can reduce carbon from the environment, changing the way that we work. So our plan is bringing all these things together, planting trees, looking at the environment. It's a picture that's been carefully worked out, and that's, as I said at the beginning, we've looked at the evidence. We say 2045 is the ultimate cut-off point. We can do most of it before then, but these aren't figures plucked out of the air. It's an evidence-based policy that we've thought through about how we all need to change our lives, how we all will feed into that. So I think the government that we're legislating that will reach that 2045 target.
Thank you. Mike had tucked a little question on the end there, which I just wonder whether any of the candidates want to come back on. That was about a carbon tax. Does anybody actually want to pick up an answer, whether they would...
Is that be a really fast way of making large companies or any company reduce their carbon footprint? Because at the moment it's expressed as trees, which is lovely, but it doesn't actually mean anything. So if you go on a carbon calculator and you put in, I'm going to say 50 tonnes of carbon, what does that look like? You'll get some of the tree calculators come back and say it's about 120 trees. Then you got other ones that come back and say 3,000 trees. It's a very difficult way to equate it. It'd be far easier if you said a tonne of carbon is worth 30 quid.
It's a fascinating way of looking at it. Yeah, and that's why I'll definitely speak to you about this afterwards, if that's okay. Because I'm racking my brains for our party's commitment to a carbon tax. And while I can talk about a windfall tax on these big polluters, I can't specifically say it's a carbon tax, because I don't think it's based on what you've just proposed. So I'd like to speak to you afterwards about it, if that's okay.
Yeah, likewise, I'm not sure that we've approached it in that particular way, but we have as the Liberal Democrats looked at ways of increasing taxes on people who are bigger polluters. One of those things which has been controversial but we think would be effective would be to change the way we tax flights, so that people who are very regular flyers pay higher taxes than those who just once or twice a year take a flight. But looking at things like that, so it is something which I think is worth looking at.
Sorry, whichever order.
I think a lot of the variance in the different costs for carbon is based on trees being planted. It's just the variety of tree being planted. You get a wide range of... the hybrid poplar is one of the best trees to be planting if you want to sequester away as much carbon as possible. I've seen figures around 20 quid per tonne for if you're using that technique. So I think we can hopefully address the issue that way.
I think the principle of polluter pays is quite established in our economy and our society, and I think we need to do more of it. So if that could well be one way to affect change. Equally, I think that people are all behind this issue now. I don't meet anybody who denies climate change. So I think the question now is about how we channel that energy and we use it to make the changes that our society needs.
Donald Trump.
Well, interestingly, I've not actually met him.
Not yet. Nigel Lawson, yes? Not yet, no.
Thank you. We're going to return to the topic of Brexit, but with a slightly different angle, with a question from Michael. Michael, sorry, we don't have your surname, Michael.
Thank you. Acknowledging that there are huge tensions in the country following the referendum, if elected, how would the candidates go about starting a process of healing?
Kieran, yes.
No matter which way it turns out, the Yorkshire Party wants to make sure that we get a good deal for Yorkshire, so that we can make sure that whether it's Westminster or Brussels we're dealing with, things work out best for Yorkshire. So we do want to make sure that whatever deal goes through, that we are benefiting Yorkshire best we can.
Well, I think the last few years in our politics have been pretty grim. I think they have been. This is an issue which has divided political parties, divided communities, workplaces, even families. So we do need to bring our country back together again. I think it will be tough to do so. I think the only way we can do it is to actually honour the referendum result. I know that that is not going to be a popular answer in this audience. However, if we did not honour the referendum result, let's think what that might be. We would be left with all the issues that led to the calling of the referendum in the first place. All the issues. Just remember that the first party that called for the in-out referendum was the Liberal Democrats. The issues which caused the vote would still be there, only would have a new big problem to solve, and that would be 17.4 million people who had their vote taken away from them. So that's why I think we need to honour the referendum result. But we need to do it in a way which is going to be as smooth as possible, so there are no jolts for business. We have a smooth result in terms of trade. The countries that we are talking about are our closest in terms of values, trade, defence, culture, and indeed family. So we therefore need to make sure these are maintained. But we will have to recognise that the British people have made a decision, and we need therefore to respect it. The British people are bigger than politicians.
So let's set the record straight on some of what was said. People say the Liberal Democrats were the first to call for a referendum. That was in completely different circumstances in 2008. That was around the Lisbon Treaty. It was not, the cause of this referendum was Tory infighting. And that's what torn apart by this, and it is appalling that families and friends and work colleagues, this atmosphere that's been created, it's horrific. So how do we solve it? Forcing through Brexit is not going to solve it. And this let's get Brexit done mantra, it's nonsense, because this deal does not get Brexit done. It's just the beginning of years and years more of negotiations. The government accepts, all credible economists say it's going to make us poorer. That is not right for this country, and I can't stand by and let that happen. So, how do we solve it? Well, the Liberal Democrats, for the last 3 years, have said the best way to resolve this is with a referendum on the deal. And we haven't backed away from that. Now, we said, if you made us the government, then that would be a mandate to stop Brexit right away. But reality is it would take an absolute earthquake for that to happen. We will continue campaigning for a referendum. In the circumstances where there was a referendum that was won by a narrow margin on the back of misleading information, where what promises were made that are impossible to fulfil, and what we're going to get will resemble in no way what was promised to the people in 2016. And so the discontent will only continue if we impose on people that. So the best way forward now is we have a deal. Let's tell to people, this is what Brexit looks like now. You know how it's going to affect your lives. And this is what you've got. And let's ask the people again whether this is really what they want, because it's unforgivable to impose this on people when it's going to damage so many of our lives. There is no simple way of resolving Brexit. We can't just close the box and pretend it never happened. But the best way to do it is to go back to the people and ask them whether this is what they want.
So the question is about how. How do we move past this? How do we heal our country after years of infighting over this issue? Now, Labour is the only party at this election with a manifesto pledge to put it back to the people. We have on one side, it is true, on one side we have the Conservative Party that will ram through a damaging Brexit that will risk workers' rights, risk our economy and risk jobs. On the other side we have the Liberal Democrats saying that they will cancel Brexit. And they've made a very big song and dance about that. And I know that it's popular with some people in the audience tonight. But the question was about healing. Yes, Tory infighting led to this referendum. But it isn't the cause of Leave actually winning the vote in 2016. The root causes of Brexit that led to so many people disenfranchised and disillusioned with our politics was the fact that we've had, at that point, 6 years of austerity implemented by the coalition government and then implemented by the Conservatives on their own. If you go back and say, no, we're just going to cancel Brexit, I tell you now, many of those 17 million people will be extremely angry and will not forget. But at the same time, I know that if we just ram through Brexit under the Conservatives, we're going to have 16 million Remainers who are very angry and will immediately campaign to rejoin the EU, me being one of them. So we have to move past this. We have to bring people together. And that's why Labour is proposing, and I support, a legally binding referendum. One that we cannot just walk away from. A sensible deal that will protect jobs and workers' rights in this country versus Remain. I cannot hide from the fact that I think Remain is the better option, and I will certainly be campaigning for Remain in any second referendum. But if we are going to move past this, if we are going to bring people back together, we have to give them the choice of leaving or staying once again, once we know all of the facts, and it can't be disputed that the government will implement their decision.
We're going to bring it back to a more local focus again now, and we have a question from Renee. Renee, your surname's unstuck me, sorry. Thank you. About transport and housing.
Good evening, candidates. Large-scale housing developments taking place in Harrogate will generate thousands of new peak-hour journeys. Normally, most of these journeys would be by car, adding to congestion and air pollution on our roads that cycling and walking alone will do little to address. What would you suggest is done to accommodate this demand in a way which reduces congestion and meets our carbon reduction targets?
Well, I think we need to have a public transport offer which actually people are choosing, so they will not choose to use their vehicle. We know that 10,000 people leave Harrogate every day to work in Leeds. We know that 8,000 people leave Leeds to work in Harrogate. That was in the last census. It's no surprise, therefore, that the trains and the buses and the roads are busy. We have, therefore, to put more capacity into our public transport and to improve its quality so that people are choosing to use it. I've spent a significant amount of time and effort trying to get that done. That's why I was so pleased yesterday, for example, to attend the launch of the 6 services per day to and from London. We haven't had that level of service, rail service, from Harrogate to London and back in decades. That's why I was also absolutely delighted when we had the win of a grant to make our buses, a bus fleet, an electric bus fleet. When I was the bus minister, I created what was then called, I think, the Clean Bus Technology Fund, and people could bid into it from all over the country. They did, and fortunately, the Harrogate bid was successful. That's why we have electric buses here now. So I think the answer to your question, Renee, is all about having a public transport offer which is attractive, which is going to make people want to change their behaviour, and to make that public transport offer a sustainable one, which is why I think the buses and the trains are such good news.
And affordable. Silence in the room.
I think this public transport is a big part of it. I, as part of my job, travel an awful lot on the trains, and I spend an awful lot of my time waiting on Harrogate Station for trains that don't arrive, or waiting at Leeds or York because I've missed my connection, and then having to go and apologise, often to a judge because that's my day job as to why I'm late. And it's professionally damaging, it's personally damaging. And I know that people are saying, I can't use the trains anymore, I'm going to have to get in my car. Because it's great we've got more trains to London, but the problem is the local trains. Similarly with the buses, within Harrogate, the buses aren't that bad, but once you try and get outside Harrogate and Knaresborough, it's really tough. Trying to get to Borough Bridge or something like that on a bus is not easy. And if we're building new estates on the edges of our towns, we need to make sure that they're properly served by the buses. But it's bigger than this. It's about thinking when we build those houses that there is the infrastructure, because Andrew talked about people coming and going between Leeds and Harrogate. Well, why is that happening? Part of that, the reason is because the people who work in Harrogate can't afford to live in Harrogate. So we need to sort that issue out. Because if there was more affordable housing within our town, then people wouldn't need to be commuting backwards and forwards. So it's really part of a bigger picture. There isn't one simple solution. This is an overview of where we build our houses, the kind of houses that we build, and the public transport network as well. And if we don't address all of those issues, there are just going to be more cars on the road, and that's more congestion and more pollution.
Well, this touches on what I first spoke about when I gave my opening remarks. We have to bring our railways back into public ownership because we have to do something. We have to do something about how pricey they are. If we're going to get people out of cars and onto public transport, and public in every sense of the word, we have to sort out the railways. On top of that, I also mentioned reinstating 3,000 bus routes cut by this government. Now, it's essential that those bus routes go to rural communities where people often have to drive because there simply isn't any other alternative. And to go even further than that, we're going to allow councils to bring their bus services back into ownership, to be run by the local council. And where they choose to do that, because it will be a decision for local councils, will allow them to offer free transport, bus transport for under 25s, so that our young people can get a step up on the transport system. Yes, there's all sorts of issues with regards to housing, which I've already talked about, and I will not talk your ears off again about. But ultimately, we have to make sure that the principle of public transport is truly public, and that it serves the best interests of people. That's how you get them out of cars and back onto public transport.
The issue with transport comes down to a funding issue once again. The Yorkshire Party will make sure that we fully fund the Northern Powerhouse Rail, spending £39 billion in the area to build new railway lines. It's no coincidence that the connecting train we did get was connected to London, where most of our transport spending is a lot higher than it is in Yorkshire. But we need local trains. I'm cycling all the way to Sherburn and Elmet to help out with Yorkshire Party, a fellow candidate campaigning in the area, and it's faster for me to cycle over there on my bike in less than 2 hours than it is to take a train there. It's just ridiculous, our train connectivity in the area, and we just need more funding in that area to get everything sorted out.
Just sneak at the end. So time is running short, so we're going to just try and take the last couple of questions quite quickly. Next we move to Graham Chalmers, who's back there. Graham, would you like to put your question to the candidates, please?
Hello. My question is inspired by William Wilberforce's fight to end slave trade in the 19th century. And the question is this. I think it's something you've already all talked about, but it goes to the root of the whole problem with the direction of British politics in terms of dealing with problems. Is wide-ranging government intervention required in Britain and elsewhere to halt climate change? Or can it and should it be left to businesses, organisations and citizens to change their ways with little government encouragement?
It's got to be a combination of the two things, and that's very much the liberal philosophy, is that government is there to help and to guide people. It's not there to tell people what to do all the time. Government shouldn't be controlling what everyone is doing, but it should be nudging us in the right direction. So, if you're leading the way by setting down the targets and giving guidance for businesses and leading people in the direction that they should be going, you've got to have someone with the overview and the plan for how we're going to do this. But equally, it should be a carrot as much as a stick, and making people want to do this, not forcing them to do this against their will. And I think we've got to make people want to change the way that they live their lives, because if they don't, then we're going to destroy our planet.
But Wilberforce didn't try to get people to change their minds. He tried to get Parliament to make it illegal to have a slave trade. And that's exactly what we do.
Yeah.
But I can't hear.
Graham is saying that Wilberforce didn't get people to try to change their minds. He actually tried to encourage Parliament to make policy, make it illegal. Yeah.
I don't think you can make climate change legal, but what you can do is change the way that people run their lives and their businesses, and encourage them to go in that direction. So setting those targets. And, we've talked about putting a cost on carbon, that sort of thing. It's about government having an overview. But the better way to do it is to encourage people so they want to do it, rather than feeling like they've been forced to do it against their will.
Thanks, Graham. We have a situation now where fewer and fewer people control more and more of our wealth. And if we're going to rely on the generosity of billionaires to save us from the climate emergency, then I'm afraid we're in for a short, sharp shock at the end of this decade. I think they'll be saving themselves before they save any of us. So yes, we have to intervene. We have to use parliamentary tools. Ultimately, you want to bring people along with you. It's about winning the argument as well. But we can't just rely on the generosity of billionaires.
Fix the issue itself the same way it was caused. So I think we need to make sure we have a government that's willing to make sure that corporations and themselves are responsible for approaching the issues caused by climate change.
Graham, I think it's a mixture, the answer here. I think we need to have some top-down interventions. And I've talked about our 25-year environment plan, our clean growth strategy. But we also need to recognise that it actually is the responsibility of all of us how we will live our lives. Nobody will tell you how to live your life. Nobody will tell me how to live my life. The same applies for all of us. But we can all make the right decisions. Governments should be seeking to help people make the right decisions. Part of that is education, which goes back to the very first question we had this evening. Part of that is incentivising it. That could be subsidies for electric vehicles, as we currently have at the moment. Or it could be the extra budgets which we're going to be making available through the manifesto process for the energy efficiency of homes and schools and hospitals. But I think everybody owns this problem, because everybody will be affected by this problem if we do not resolve it.
So for our final question this evening, we have a question from Patrick Hall. Patrick Hall. Yeah.
In the spirit of everybody doing their own bit and indeed leading the way, can each of the candidates tell me if they personally use a renewable energy provider for their own home? And if not, why not?
The answer is no, because at the moment I'm using the cheapest provider. I can't tell you much about teachers' salaries, but what I can tell you is that they're not that great at the moment. However, under a Labour government, we will nationalise the supply sides of each of the energy companies to make sure that it is affordable for people to choose renewable sources, and to make sure that those companies that are not renewable at the moment become renewable or stop being companies.
Similar to my previous question, I do not use an entirely renewable source myself. I believe that we should, as in the previous question, it should be the duty of government and a top-down approach to make sure that people are moving towards more renewable sources that way, rather than holding individuals responsible to make sure they're using the best, most renewable sources.
The tariff I have is a mixed supply tariff, so it is partly renewable and partly not, which I think reflects the overall power generation we have within the country. I have certainly recognised that we all need to make changes. We'll be talking about that during the course of the evening. So I have, for example, in other areas, chosen, I do have a vehicle, and I've chosen to purchase things like an eco package to make it less of a polluting vehicle. So I think your question is about what decisions we personally take. I have made a decision to buy a mixed supply tariff, and I think we can therefore all, it goes really back to Graham's point, there is something that we can all do, even if it's through volunteering or a small decision, where we can all make a difference.
My answer is, to be honest, I don't know. I was just Googling to see whether my energy supplier was renewable. I didn't get there fast enough. But again, it's the honest answer. Octopus.
Oh, yes.
Well, then the answer is yes. But the reason for that, again, and I bet that wasn't focused on renewable, it was because it was the cheapest. And I think most people in their daily life pick the cheapest. And again, it's one of those things that we all need to rethink how we're living our lives.
That draws us to a close. So just a few things to say as we wrap up. The first is I do appreciate that many of you will have had your own questions that you would have liked to have asked this evening. And I'm sure the candidates would be very happy to answer those, either if they're staying for a few minutes now, or if you're able to email them your questions. Yeah. Secondly, do feel free to go away and fact check on our candidates' answers. There's plenty of information out there. If you want to know more about carbon reductions, just go looking for it. And I'd like to thank you as an audience for your participation and for your attention and respect for the candidates this evening. I'd also like to thank the candidates, and I have a little gift for you.
Amazing.
A little book that some of you may have read. There is no charity. Which, as whoever is elected, I hope you will take time to read that and that we'll be able to work together going forward. Mike Berners-Lee, an expert in carbon footprinting, has given us some really good pointers for how we decarbonise in that. I'd just like to thank Reverend Dixon again and for the use of Wesley Chapel, and he's given us this building free of charge this evening. If you feel like donating something just for the heating and lighting and for the use, there's a donation bowl on the way out. Any donations for the use of the building would be gratefully received. Zero Carbon Harrogate runs a number of different events. You can look them up on our website. We happen to have one tomorrow night. So 2 in 1 week. It's very unusual for us. But we have a low carbon Christmas event. And if you'd like to come and get some top Christmas tips, we're at the Friends Meeting House tomorrow evening. And we also have the pleasure of Councillor Phil Ireland, coming to tell us about the Harrogate Climate Coalition, newly formed climate coalition, which is going to be working to try to take our district forward on this agenda. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the candidates again. Can we just give them a final... And I would encourage you to vote well and vote for the climate.
Obviously it's illegal. It's a joke.
It's often you. When did it run out of battery?
3 times. It lasts about an hour. Can I get a group pic just together? Is that all right? And then I'll share this one with you.
Do we all need to group in?
Just a little bit closer, if that's all right. Yeah. Do you mind just go that way a little bit because you look like you were wedged together. You were showing political bias to the Conservatives. Okay, big smiles. And again, nice big smile. I'll just come back a bit. And just last one. Brilliant. Thank you. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I look forward to watching.
You know, it's going to be a hell of an edit, to be honest. Yeah.